$40,000, Castellano said. And don't miss. The shooter straightened his tie, clipped a fake badge to his collar, and walked into the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan like he owned the floor beneath his feet. He had a table number, a target, and 11 minutes before the private dining section turned over. He had done this 4 times before. He had never missed. At that exact moment, a waitress named Claire Morgan was carrying 2 plates she could never afford to eat, moving through a room full of people who would never see her, heading straight toward the most dangerous booth in the building. She had no idea. He did. If this story hits you, subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The shift had already been 12 hours long before Claire Morgan even reached the private dining section. She knew the weight of a 12-hour shift, the way most people knew the weight of grief, not as a concept, but as something that lived in your body. In the small of her back, in the thin skin between her shoulder blades, in the soles of her feet that had stopped asking for rest somewhere around hour 8 and simply made peace with the pain. It was a Thursday night in October, and the rain outside was the kind that didn't come straight down. It came sideways. It came in waves. It wrapped around the corners of buildings on Franklin Street and pushed through the gaps in doorways like it had somewhere to be inside. Tribeca was always beautiful in this kind of weather. At least from the outside, the old warehouse facades turning dark with water, the cobblestones catching the reflection of restaurant windows glowing amber and gold. But Claire wasn't outside. She was in the weeds. That was the term they used in restaurant kitchens when the orders backed up and the timing fell apart and the rhythm of service fractured into controlled chaos. In the weeds. It always sounded too gentle to her. Something that grew in a garden. Something you could pull out by the root and leave behind. This wasn't that. "Table 12 is asking about their halibut," said Danny, passing her at the service station without making eye contact, because making eye contact in the middle of a rush meant acknowledging that you were both drowning. "Tell them 5 minutes," Claire said, tucking 2 dessert plates under her arm in a move she'd practiced 10,000 times, the kind of unconscious competence that looks effortless from the outside and feels like controlled falling from the inside. "I already told them 5 minutes. Danny said. "That was 7 minutes ago." "Then tell them 2 more minutes." "What if it's not 2 more minutes? Danny." She stopped. She looked at him. "Tell them 2 more minutes." He disappeared. Claire moved through the dining room the way she always moved through it, with the particular invisibility of someone who had learned that the guests who paid $400 for dinner didn't want to see the machinery of their experience. They wanted to believe that the food materialized, that the wine refilled itself, that the carefully curated environment they were sitting inside simply existed fully formed, without the sweat and calculation of the people who built it around them every single night. She was good at disappearing, had been really her whole life. It wasn't self-pity that made her think it. It was just true. Growing up in Queens with a mother whose health had been uncertain since Claire was 14 had a way of teaching you that the best thing you could do in most situations was be useful without being noticed. Draw attention to yourself, and you drew attention to your need. Drew attention to your need, and people started calculating what it would cost them. Better to be invisible, better to be capable and quiet and available in all the ways that mattered without demanding anything in return. It had kept her mother housed. It had kept the lights on through the lean years. It had gotten her this job at Augusto's, which was the kind of Manhattan restaurant that required 3 months of references and a trial shift and a 15-minute interview with the floor manager, where he'd asked her with complete seriousness to describe her philosophy of hospitality. She'd said, "I believe the best service is the kind that makes guests feel like the most important person in the room without ever making them feel watched." She'd gotten the job. That was 3 years ago. And 3 years in, she still believed it. She just also believed at hour 12 of a Thursday shift that believing something and feeling it were 2 very different things. The call came from the floor manager, Renata, a small, precise woman from Sao Paulo who ran Augusto's front of house with the efficiency of a Swiss watch and the warmth of approximately 1 Swiss watch. "Morgan," Claire turned. Renata was standing at the partition that separated the main dining room from the private section, a stretch of 4 booths at the far end of the restaurant, curtained off with heavy velvet panels reserved for guests who paid a premium not just for food, but for the particular luxury of not being seen by other people who were paying a premium not to be seen. "I need you on booth 4, Renata said. "I have 12 and 14. "Danny's taking 12 and 14. I need you on booth 4. Something in Renata's tone stopped Claire from pushing back. Not urgency. Not exactly. It was more like a very controlled version of urgency. The version that meant the situation was already decided, and the only variable was whether Claire would make it complicated. "Okay," Claire said. "Who's in 4? Renata looked at her for a moment. Then she said quietly, "Victor Moretti." The name landed the way heavy things land, without drama, without fanfare, just wait. Claire had heard of Victor Moretti the way everyone in New York had heard of Victor Moretti, which was to say she knew the outline without knowing the details. Old money, new power, real estate and import-export, and consulting firms that somehow generated enormous revenue without ever being clearly explained. His name appeared in business sections, occasionally in crime sections, always with careful language, alleged, reported, understood to be associated with. He had a face that appeared in glossy magazines at charity events, a jaw that photographers seemed to love, eyes that even in photographs made you feel like he was the one who had decided to let himself be photographed and could just as easily have decided otherwise. He had a reputation. She didn't know the specifics. She knew enough. "What does he want?" she asked. "What do the people in booth 4 always want?" Renata said. "He wants to eat in peace and not be bothered and have everything be perfect and not feel like he's being managed." A pause. "Don't manage him. Just take care of him." "How many in the party?" "He's alone." That surprised her. She didn't say so. "Any dietary restrictions on file?" His assistant called ahead. "Nothing fried, nothing sweet, water still not sparkling. He'll order the rest himself." Renata straightened her jacket. "He's been here twice before. Both times he left a 40% tip and a card that said one word." "What word?" Renata almost smiled. "Adequate." Booth 4 was at the very end of the private section, set slightly apart from the other 3 booths, separated by a half wall of frosted glass that caught the light from above and scattered it in soft patterns across the velvet banquette. Someone had placed a single candle on the table, the kind of detail that was intentional and was supposed to look unintentional. Victor Moretti was already seated when Claire pushed through the curtain. She had a half-second before he looked up, and she used it the way she used every professional half-second, to take in as much information as possible without appearing to look. He was larger than photographs suggested, not in a way that was aggressive, but in the way that some people simply occupied more space than their dimensions technically required. He sat with a stillness that wasn't passive, it was deliberate. The kind of stillness that came from someone who had spent years learning to be watched and had decided that the best response to being watched was to give the watchers nothing. Dark suit, no tie. His hands were on the table, both of them, fingers relaxed, and he was looking at the menu with the focused attention of someone who was actually reading it rather than using it as a prop. He looked up. His eyes were gray, or dark brown. She couldn't quite tell in the candlelight, and she made a mental note not to think about it further because it was an irrelevant detail. "Good evening," she said. "I'm Claire. I'll be taking care of you tonight." "Just tonight," he said. It wasn't flirtatious. It was, and she processed this, instantly a test. A small one. The kind of thing someone said when they wanted to see how you handled unexpected deviation from the script. Whether you got flustered, whether you reached for the corporate language and hid behind it, whether you were actually present or just performing presence. "For as long as you need," she said, not missing a beat. "Can I start you with something to drink while you look over the menu? Or have you already decided?" Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible. A slight release of something. "Water," he said. "Still. And give me a few more minutes." "Of course." She poured his water and stepped back to the appropriate distance, close enough to be available, far enough to be unobtrusive, and she did what she always did in the private section, which was nothing. She existed in a way that made her presence feel like an absence. It was a skill. She'd never figured out how to explain it to anyone who didn't already have it. He ordered after 4 minutes. He ordered in the specific, clear language of someone who had done this many times, not in a way that was rude, just in a way that was exact. The duck, the heirloom tomatoes to start, no dressing on the side, just the reduction. A glass of the 2019 Barolo, if they had it open. They had it open. She said, "Excellent choice," and then stopped herself because it was a filler phrase, meaningless, the kind of thing you said on autopilot, and something about the way he was watching her made her feel like he'd notice. She said instead, "I'll put that in now." He nodded. She thought she saw the corner of his mouth move, not quite a smile, something in the neighborhood of one. The restaurant for the first 90 minutes of Victor Moretti's dinner moved around him the way water moves around a stone. The kitchen delivered on time. The Barolo was exactly the right temperature. He ate slowly, deliberately, with the focused attention he seemed to bring to everything, and Claire circled his booth with the particular radar she'd developed over years of reading tables, that sense of when a guest needed something before they knew they needed it. She refilled his water glass twice without being asked. She noticed at some point that there were 2 men seated at a table near the entrance to the private section who had not ordered any food. They had drinks in front of them that they weren't drinking. They were positioned so that they could see booth 4 without appearing to look at it. She didn't ask Renata about them. She already knew. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that there was a third man. And this third man was not seated. He was standing, which was unremarkable because there were servers standing throughout the restaurant. He was wearing the right clothes, white shirt, black pants, the working uniform of the place, and he had a laminated staff badge clipped to his collar that she'd never seen before tonight. She would think about this later. The badge. The way it was slightly too bright under the light, like it was too new, like someone had printed it that same afternoon. She would think about how she'd noticed it and filed it and moved on, because in a restaurant you notice things and moved on constantly, and you couldn't investigate every anomaly or you'd never get through the shift. She would think about what it would have meant if she had investigated, but that was later. At the time, she was standing at the service station, entering a note into the system about the Barolo when Danny appeared beside her. "Who's the third guy?" Danny said low. She didn't look up. "What third guy?" "The one near the partition. I've never seen him before. He's been circling the private section for 10 minutes. Now she looked up. The man was standing with his back to her, and from behind he looked exactly like any other server-measured posture professional, bearing the kind of studied calm that the front-of-house staff at Augusto's were trained to project. But Danny was right. She didn't recognize him, and she knew every server on the floor tonight. "I'll check with Renata," she said. She checked with Renata. Renata said, "Which man where?" And when Claire turned to point, he was gone. She went back to booth 4. Victor's plate was nearly clear. He'd eaten with the focused efficiency of a man who saw food as something to be addressed, rather than an experience to be prolonged. But she noticed he'd left 3 precise bites of the duck on the plate, which she'd learned over years of observation was often the unconscious behavior of someone whose attention was partially elsewhere, eating while thinking about something else, leaving the last few bites behind because the mind had moved on before the hand did. He was looking at his phone, not scrolling, reading. The screen was tilted slightly away from her. "Can I take that for you?" she asked, gesturing to the plate. He looked up. For a fraction of a second, and she noticed this later replaying it, he looked at her with something that wasn't quite his usual controlled assessment, something that was more like recognition, though they'd only just met. Like she was someone he'd been thinking about, not her specifically, but a person like her, and she'd arrived at the exact moment he was thinking it. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." She reached for the plate, and then she heard it. Later, for months, for years, in the middle of nights when she woke with her heart already racing, she would try to explain what she heard and why it stopped her. It wasn't loud. It was the opposite of loud. In a room full of conversation and soft music and the percussion of a functioning kitchen, it was the smallest possible sound, a faint metallic click, the kind of sound a door latch makes when it's been oiled, the kind of sound a pen makes when you click it, the kind of sound that should have been nothing, that was nothing to anyone else in the room that she could not have consciously identified as dangerous, but her body knew. She did not think gun. She did not think danger. She did not think anything. Her nervous system made a decision that her brain had not yet caught up to, and what it decided was between. She moved. Not away, not back. Between. She threw herself across the booth, arms out, body dropping, covering Victor Moretti at exactly the angle that placed her torso between him and the direction the sound had come from, and the motion was so fast and so unexpected that her shoulder hit the edge of the table on the way down, and the water glass went over, and the candle skidded, and the entire private section shifted into a different register of reality. The shot was loud. Everything that had been quiet became loud at once. The gunshot punched through the ambient noise of the restaurant and tore it open, and in the 2 full seconds of stunned silence that followed, the silence of everyone realizing what the sound was, the glass panel of the half wall to the right of booth 4 exploded outward, showering the empty space where 2 seconds earlier no one had been standing. Then the screaming started. Victor Moretti's hands were on her shoulders, both of them. She felt the grip before she understood where she was face down across the banquette, half over him, her left shoulder burning in a way that was spreading outward from a specific point, and she didn't want to think about what that meant. "Don't move," he said. His voice was completely level, not calm in the way of someone who wasn't afraid, but calm in the way of someone who had long since made peace with the fact that fear was a variable and could be set aside. "Don't move." "I'm not moving," she said. Her voice surprised her. It was also level. "There may be a second shooter." "Okay. I need you to stay down." "I'm already down." "Claire." Her name. He used her name. She didn't know when he'd memorized it. "I need you to listen to me. Can you hear me clearly?" She became aware that she was breathing very fast. She slowed it down by force of will. "Yes," she said. "I can hear you. We're going to move toward the floor. Together. On 3. You stay in contact with me the whole time." The restaurant had become very loud now. The screaming had multiplied the sound of chairs being knocked back of heels on marble, of someone shouting in the kitchen, and below it, cutting through it, she heard the sound of heavy footsteps coming fast. The 2 men from the table near the entrance. She heard them before she saw them. "On 3, Victor said. 1, she said. 2, he said. 3. They moved together. Later, she would not be able to fully reconstruct the next several minutes. They had the fractured, non-sequential quality of shock, not traumatic amnesia exactly, but the way the brain edits footage under extreme stress, cutting between moments, losing the connective tissue of normal time. She remembered the floor, the cold of it against her cheek. She remembered Victor Moretti's hand flat against her back, not crushing, not panicked, just there holding steady, and she remembered thinking that it was the most certain thing in the room. That hand, that pressure. She remembered one of the security men crouching over them both, speaking in low, rapid bursts into an earpiece, scanning the room. She remembered that her shoulder had stopped burning and started going numb, which she understood distantly was not an improvement. She remembered Renata, composed, somehow extraordinary in her composure, clearing the remaining guests from the private section with the crisp efficiency of someone running a very complicated fire drill. She remembered Victor turning to look at her directly, and she remembered the exact quality of his expression, the calculation in it, but underneath the calculation something else. Something that was trying to work out who she was and how she had moved the way she'd moved before the shot landed and what it meant that she had. "You heard it," he said. It wasn't a question. She wasn't sure what to say. "I heard something." "Most people don't hear it," he said. "Most people trained for this don't hear it." "I wasn't trained for anything." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said quietly, "I know." The sirens started, and for the second time that night, for the first time in years, really Claire Morgan felt entirely visible. Not in the way she'd always avoided, not in the way that made her feel exposed, in the way that meant she had been seen doing something that mattered by someone who understood the difference between the things that mattered and the things that only looked like they did. Her shoulder had started bleeding through her uniform. She could feel it, though she was doing her best not to look at it. Victor saw it at exactly the moment she decided to ignore it. "You need a doctor," he said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You've been shot." "I've been grazed," she said. She didn't actually know the difference yet technically, but it sounded more manageable, and manageable was what she needed it to be. Claire. Again her name. Again that odd quality of certainty, like he'd known her much longer than 45 minutes. Thank you. She looked at him. His gray-brown eyes were level on hers, and she thought in the way that stray thoughts surface in extreme moments, unbidden and strange, that he was the kind of person who never said those two words lightly, that the word thank you had traveled a long distance to reach her, and she should receive it properly. You're welcome, she said. And then the paramedics were there, and the police were there, and the ordinary world came flooding back in the most disorderly way imaginable, and for a long time after that, nothing would be ordinary again. The sirens were very loud now. She could hear them bouncing off the buildings outside, refracted by the sideways rain. Somewhere in the restaurant, someone was still crying. Somewhere closer, one of Victor's men was speaking in tight, controlled Italian she couldn't follow. And somewhere outside, already gone, already dissolving into the city, the way calculated violence always dissolved a man with a gun and a printed badge, and $40,000 of someone's money was running. He had missed. He would not be the last one to try. But on this night, in the ruins of a perfect dining room, a waitress who had spent her whole life learning to be invisible had become the most visible person in New York, and the most dangerous. Because the man who had hired the shooter was watching the news already, and he had seen her face. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, and Claire had been awake for 6 hours before anyone told her the truth. The first 4 of those hours were administrative. Forms, questions. A nurse who kept calling her Han in a way that was meant to be comforting and was instead deeply unsettling. A doctor who said the word laceration 3 times in the same sentence and then seemed surprised that she'd understood all 3. The bullet had not entered her body. It had carved a path along the outer edge of her left shoulder, 3 inches of raw tissue, 12 stitches, a bandage that felt like it weighed more than the arm attached to it. You're lucky, the doctor said. I've heard that, Claire said. What she didn't say was that luck felt like an incomplete explanation for what had happened. Luck was passive. Luck was what happened to you. What she had done in that booth, whatever it was, had not felt passive. It had felt like something older than thought, like a reflex she didn't know she had until it fired. Her phone had been ringing since 4 in the morning. She'd turned it face down by hour 2. The notifications stacked up in silence texts from coworkers, missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, and one voicemail from her mother that she would listen to eventually when she had the emotional bandwidth to hear her mother cry and say, I saw the news, and tell her it was fine, she was fine, everything was fine. Her mother had enough to manage. Claire had been managing things on her behalf for 15 years. This was not going to be the thing that broke that arrangement. What broke it was the knock on the door at 6:47 in the morning. She said, "Come in," expecting a nurse, and what walked through the door instead was a man in a gray suit who moved the way people move when they've spent years in rooms where their authority was the most dangerous thing present. He was somewhere in his late 40s, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had traded that for something harder and more useful. He carried a coffee cup in one hand and a badge in the other. "Ms. Morgan," he said. "Detective Hale, NYPD, Major Crimes." Major Crimes, not the patrol unit, not a detective from the precinct who handled local incidents. Major Crimes meant the shooting had already been categorized as something larger than a restaurant altercation, which meant the classification had happened fast, which meant someone with authority had made a phone call in the night. "You look like you have coffee," she said, "and I don't." He looked at the cup. Then he looked at her. Then, without a word, he walked to the door, said something to the uniformed officer outside, and 2 minutes later, a cup of hospital coffee appeared on her bedside table. It tasted like something that had been near coffee at some point in its life. She drank it anyway. "I need to ask you some questions," Hale said, settling into the chair across from her, with the controlled ease of someone who had sat in 1,000 chairs in 1,000 hospital rooms and had decided long ago that discomfort was information he didn't need. "I figured," she said. "Go ahead. Tell me what you heard. Not what you saw, not what happened, what you heard." She noticed the precision of it. "A click," she said. Metallic, small. I was reaching for a plate, and I heard it, and I moved. Where was the sound coming from? The partition side, the frosted glass half wall to the right of the booth. He wrote something. And you moved toward the sound. I moved toward Mr. Moretti. Same direction. Yes. That's an unusual response, he said. Most people move away from a sound like that. I wasn't thinking about the sound, she said. I was thinking about him. She paused. That's not, I don't mean it the way it sounds. I just mean my body made a decision faster than I did. He studied her for a moment. Then he said, Ms. Morgan, how long have you known Victor Moretti? We met last night. He was a guest. Had you ever served him before? No. Spoken to him, communicated by any means prior to last night. She looked at him steadily. Detective, I'm a waitress. He's a man who has dinner at expensive restaurants. We don't run in the same circles. Most people don't, Hale agreed. But most people also don't take a bullet for men they met 45 minutes ago. I told you, I didn't think. It wasn't a decision I made consciously. He nodded slowly at the way that meant he had heard what she said and was filing it alongside other things he already knew. He flipped a page in his notebook. He didn't look at it. He looked at her. What do you know about Victor Moretti? What everyone knows, she said. Business, real estate. His name shows up in the papers. His name shows up in more than the papers, Hale said. And there it was. The thing she'd been waiting for since he walked through the door. The turn in the conversation where the information she was about to receive would change the shape of everything that had come before it. She didn't say anything. She waited. Hale set down the coffee cup. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and his voice dropped into a register that wasn't quiet exactly, but was precise, intentional. The voice of a man who had decided to tell her something and was choosing every word. Victor Moretti, he said, is the operating head of one of the largest organized crime networks on the eastern seaboard. His legitimate businesses are real. They're profitable. They're also a very carefully constructed surface. Underneath that surface, Ms. Morgan, there are operations spanning protection labor imports, financial laundering, and enforcement. When we say enforcement, we mean exactly what you think we mean. The room was very quiet. The attack last night, he continued, was not opportunistic. It was planned. We believe it was planned over a period of at least 3 weeks, which means whoever gave the order had intelligence on Mr. Moretti's schedule, his regular locations, and last night specifically, his booking at Augusto's. That kind of intelligence doesn't come from outside. It comes from inside. She processed this in layers. Someone in his organization told them where he'd be. That's our working theory. And the shooter, in the wind. We have partial footage from outside the restaurant. We have the badge he used printed fake good enough for a busy service entrance in bad weather. We have a table he sat at for 20 minutes and wiped clean before he moved into position. A pause. We have very little, Miss Morgan. What we have most clearly is you. She sat with that. What does that mean? It means, Hale said, that the shooter missed his primary target. And the reason the shooter missed his primary target is because you moved in a way that obscured the angle at the last possible second, which means Victor Moretti is alive because of what you did. He paused. It also means that the people who hired that shooter now have your face on every news broadcast in the city, your name, your story. His eyes were level on hers, and what she saw in them was not cruelty. It was the particular compassion of someone delivering information they know is going to cause damage. By saving his life, Ms. Morgan, you've put yourself in a position that may require us to consider your safety. The word safety landed differently than she expected, not as reassurance, as a category, as a thing that was now uncertain where before it had simply been assumed. Are you telling me I'm in danger? She said. I'm telling you the people who ordered a hit on the most protected man in Manhattan did not achieve their goal, Hale said. People like that tend to revisit their goals. The silence stretched. Then Claire said, I need to call my mother. Hale said, Yes, you should. He stood, buttoned his jacket, picked up his coffee. He was almost at the door when she said, Detective. He stopped. The men at the table near the entrance to the private section, the two who weren't drinking, were they his? Hale turned back. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "Yes," he said. "They moved after the shot, not before." "I know. But I moved before." "Yes," he said. "You did." And in his voice was something that sounded almost like wonder. Not the sentimental kind. The kind that comes from a person who has spent 20 years studying human behavior under extreme conditions and has just witnessed something that doesn't fit the model. "Get some rest, Ms. Morgan. Someone will be outside your door." He left. She sat in the recycled air with the bad coffee and the 12 stitches and the weight of what he'd told her pressing down on her chest like a second body. And she thought about her mother, and she thought about her shift tomorrow, which she would not be working. And she thought about the very particular silence that happens in a restaurant right after a gunshot before the screaming starts. The way sound leaves the room for one full breath. And she thought about Victor Moretti's hand on her back, the steadiness of it, the certainty. She reached for her phone. She turned it face up. 47 missed calls, 23 text messages, and a news alert from a New York Times notification that read, "Hero Waitress shields crime-linked businessman from assassination attempt in Tribeca restaurant." She read it twice. Crime-linked. That was the careful language, the language the papers used when they knew something and couldn't print all of it. She thought about what Hale had said. Organized crime, Eastern Seaboard, enforcement. She thought about how Victor Moretti had said with complete steadiness while they were both on the floor and the room was falling apart, "Don't move." She thought about how she had said, "I'm already down." And she thought for the first time, but not the last, that there was something in him that she had recognized in that moment. Not the danger, not the power. Something underneath both of those things. Something that felt even now in retrospect like a person who had gotten very good at holding everything together and was very tired of it. She recognized that because it was also what she was. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She stared at it for 3 rings. Then she answered. "Ms. Morgan." The voice was male-controlled with an accent she couldn't immediately place. Northern Italian, she thought, without knowing why she thought it. "My name is Marco Romano. I work for Mr. Moretti. He asked me to call and inquire about your condition." She said, "I have 12 stitches and bad coffee." A pause. Then, "He said to tell you the Barolo was excellent." Despite everything, she almost laughed. "Tell him I'll pass the compliment to the sommelier. He would also like you to know," Marco continued, and the controlled quality of his voice shifted almost imperceptibly, like a current changing direction beneath a still surface, "that he considers himself personally responsible for what happened to you. He would like the opportunity to address that responsibility directly when you're feeling well enough." She thought about saying no. She constructed the sentence in her mind. "Thank Mr. Moretti for the call, but I think it's best if we don't." She built it word by word, and then she thought about 47 missed calls, and a news alert, and a detective from Major Crimes who had said the word safety, as though it were a variable that could go either way. "I'll think about it," she said. "Of course." Another pause. "Ms. Morgan, for what it's worth, and I have worked for Mr. Moretti for 11 years, and I have seen a great many things in that time, what you did last night was extraordinary. Not just brave, extraordinary." She didn't know how to respond to that. She said, "Goodbye, Mr. Romano." She ended the call. Outside her window, the rain from the night before had stopped, and the city was doing what it always did, moving, pushing, rebuilding itself minute by minute into the only version of itself it knew how to be. Cabs, voices, the distant percussion of construction that never fully stopped. She thought, "I had a life yesterday. It was not a great life. It was not an easy life, but it was mine, and I understood all of it, and I knew where every piece was." She thought, "I don't know where any of the pieces are anymore." She thought, "I need to call my mother." She called her mother. Her mother answered on the first ring, which meant she had been sitting with the phone in her hand, which meant she had been doing that since the news broke, which meant she had spent the night awake and afraid in the apartment in Woodside, that Claire paid most of the rent on watching the news coverage loop. Watching her daughter's blurred image on the restaurant's security footage, watching the headline crawl beneath it. "Baby," her mother said. Just that. Just the word. And Claire, who had been level and measured through the doctor and the detective and the controlled Italian voice on the phone, felt something in her chest fold over. "I'm okay, Mom," she said. "I have some stitches. I'm okay. I saw the news. I'm okay. They said there was a gun. I'm okay, Mom. I promise. I'm sitting in a hospital bed drinking terrible coffee, and I'm completely okay." A long silence. Then her mother's voice came back smaller. "What happened?" "Someone fired a gun in the restaurant," Claire said. "I moved. I'm fine." "You moved toward it." She didn't answer. "Claire." Her mother's voice now had an edge. She recognized the edge that appeared when her mother was done being afraid and had moved into something else, something harder and quieter. "I raised you to be careful. I raised you to look out for yourself. What were you thinking?" "I wasn't thinking," Claire said. "That's the honest answer. I wasn't thinking at all." Another silence. Then her mother said quietly, "You've been taking care of people your whole life. Since you were 14 years old, you've been taking care of me, and before that you were taking care of your brother, and before that, Mom. I'm saying that's what you do. That's the first thing you reach for. Someone's in trouble, you go toward it. Mom." I know. I just..." The breath on the other end of the line was unsteady. "I don't know how to be grateful and terrified at the same time." "You do it the same way I do," Claire said, "one breath at a time." They stayed on the phone for 20 minutes after that. Her mother told her about the calls she'd received from neighbors, from distant relatives, who'd seen the news, from the church ladies who were apparently organizing a prayer chain. Claire half listened and fully loved her, and thought about the cost of her mother's medication, and the cost of the apartment, and the fact that she no longer had a job. That thought arrived quietly, but with great weight. She no longer had a job. She'd known it somewhere, but she'd been managing it behind other thoughts. Now it settled. Renata had sent a text, careful, professional, deeply regretful, explaining that in light of the circumstances and the ongoing police investigation and the media attention, Augusto's management had decided that it would be best to put Claire's position on indefinite suspension pending review. She was welcome to expect her final paycheck by the end of the week. Indefinite suspension pending review. The careful language again. The surface that sat on top of what it actually meant, which was, we cannot have a waitress who is connected to an attempted mob assassination working our dining room floor. We cannot have that energy in our space. She had understood. She'd texted back, "Thank you for letting me know." She had not added what she wanted to add, which was, "I saved a man's life in your restaurant, and I did it while carrying your dishes, and I've worked 12-hour shifts here for 3 years without a sick day, and this is how it ends." She hadn't added that, because Renata was just doing her job, because the restaurant was just protecting itself, because everyone was just being reasonable, and reasonable was what you were when you needed to survive. The doctor came in at 10 and told her she could leave by noon if her blood pressure stayed stable. She said it would. He said he'd check back. He left. At 10:23, Hale came back. He didn't knock this time. He opened the door and stood in the frame, and the expression on his face was different from the one he'd left with. Controlled still, but tighter. Something had happened in the hours since their conversation, and it had recalibrated something in him. "What is it?" she said. "We found the shooter's badge supplier," he said. "Someone who makes documents. We pulled his client list." He stepped into the room, closed the door. "The order for the shooter's badge was placed 3 days ago. Standard lead time. The client paid in cash, used a name we're running down, picked it up in person. And the pickup address," Hale said, "was a block and a half from your apartment." The room was very still. "That could be coincidence?" she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. "It could be," Hale said. "But when I factor it against a separate piece of information we received this morning, which is that someone made inquiries about your home address through a data broker service in the early hours of this morning, within 4 hours of the attack, it starts to feel like less of a coincidence." Her address. Someone had looked up her address. "You need to not go home," Hale said. "At least not yet. Not until we understand the scope of what we're dealing with. Where am I supposed to go?" The question came out smaller than she intended. "That," Hale said, "is actually something I wanted to discuss with you." He sat back down in the chair. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at her. Mr. Moretti's legal team contacted us this morning. They've made an offer. Voluntary cooperation, full access names that could take us 3 steps further in a case we've been building for 2 years in exchange for a specific request. He paused. He wants to provide you with protection, temporary, guarded location outside the city, his security apparatus. She stared at him. You want me to go live with the man I saved, she said, who is allegedly connected to organized crime. I want you to be safe, Hale said. Those are not always the same location. He let that sit. But in this specific case, Ms. Morgan, the honest answer is that Victor Moretti's security resources are functionally more robust than what the NYPD can provide you on short notice with the budget constraints we're currently operating under. That's a remarkably honest thing for a detective to say. I've found that honest is usually faster, Hale said. You can say no. We'll figure something out, but I want you to have the information. She thought about her apartment, the address that someone had looked up at 3 a.m, the man in the fake badge who had stood near the partition and vanished before she could point him out. She thought about 47 missed calls and her mother's voice saying one breath at a time. She thought about Marco Romano saying quietly that she had been extraordinary. She thought about Victor Moretti's hand on her back. Not possessive, not protective in the way of someone who wanted something in return. Just there, certain. The hand of someone who in the middle of chaos had decided that this one small thing's steadiness was what he could offer. If I say yes, she said, what does that look like? Hale pulled a card from his jacket pocket. Mr. Romano will explain the specifics, but the short version is guarded property in Westchester, full security detail, medical follow-up for your shoulder, and access to you maintained by our department, meaning you are not beyond our reach. He set the card on the blanket. You are not going into a black box, Miss Morgan. You're going somewhere safer than here. She looked at the card. Marco Romano. A phone number. Nothing else. She picked it up. Okay, she said. Hale nodded. One more thing, she said. Yes? The man who ordered the hit, she said. Do you know who it is? Hale's expression shifted a small movement barely there. We have a name we're working with, he said. Is he going to try again? A long pause, and in that pause was the whole answer even without the words. Yes, Hale said. In all likelihood, yes. She nodded slowly. She looked at the window. The city moved below her, ordinary and merciless, doing what it always did. Then I'd rather be somewhere that makes it harder for him, she said. She reached for her phone. She dialed Marco Romano's number. He picked up on the second ring. She said, Tell Mr. Moretti I accept. And 3 miles away, in a building in Midtown, whose top 3 floors were occupied by Victor Moretti's private offices, a man put down the phone and looked at the window for a long moment. His jaw was set. His eyes were the gray-brown of a sky deciding whether to storm. Marco stood in the doorway and said, She said yes. Victor didn't turn immediately. When he did, his expression was not relief exactly. It was the expression of a man who had been carrying a specific weight since 4 a.m. and had just been told where to set it down. Make sure she has everything she needs, he said, already arranged. Her mother's address. Make sure someone's watching it. Marco paused. You think they'd go after her mother? I think, Victor said, that the kind of person who puts a shooter in a restaurant goes after everything they can reach. His voice was quiet, measured. Make sure they can't reach her mother. Marco left. Victor turned back to the window. He had been shot at before. He had been the target of plans that were far more sophisticated than last night's. He had survived because he was careful, and because he had surrounded himself with people who were also careful, and because he had over many years developed a very precise understanding of how violence worked and how to position himself in relation to it. He had never been saved by a waitress with 12 stitches and bad coffee, who described getting shot as being grazed like it was a minor scheduling conflict. He didn't know what to do with that. He was going to have to figure it out, because she was coming. And because the people who had missed him last night were already making new plans. He could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives, not as fact, but as pressure, as a change in the air. And in the middle of that calculation, that cold, precise reading of the threat matrix, a thought surfaced that he hadn't expected. She heard the click. Nobody heard the click. He had been in this world for 30 years, and he had known men trained specifically to hear sounds like that who had not heard it. And she had heard it, a tired waitress at the end of a 12-hour shift, and she had moved not away, but toward, and she had been right and fast and entirely without hesitation. He didn't know what that was. He didn't have a word for it. But he knew with the same certainty with which he knew everything that mattered that it was not coincidence, and that the person who had made that move was now in danger because of him. And that was a debt he intended to pay in full. Marco Romano arrived at the hospital at 12:15 p.m. in a black SUV that was so clean it looked like it had never touched a road before. He was exactly as his voice had suggested, precise, compact, with the kind of stillness that comes from years of being the most prepared person in any room. He brought a bag with a change of clothes her size, which meant someone had done research she hadn't authorized, and she decided not to comment on it because she was tired and her shoulder hurt, and she needed to pick her battles. "How did you know my size?" she said anyway. "We're thorough," Marco said. "That's not reassuring." "It wasn't meant to be reassuring," he said. "It was meant to be accurate." She almost liked him for that. The drive to Westchester took 40 minutes. Marco sat in the front. Claire sat in the back with a woman named Sasha, who was introduced as a medical coordinator, and who spent the drive checking Claire's blood pressure and asking questions about her pain level in the efficient, emotionally neutral way of someone who had done this many times for many different people in many different circumstances. Claire answered everything honestly. Sasha wrote things down. Neither of them talked about where they were going. At some point somewhere past the Bronx, Claire looked out the window and thought, 48 hours ago, I was worried about Table 12's halibut. She almost laughed. The laugh didn't quite make it out. The estate was behind a gate that opened before the car reached it, which meant someone had been watching their approach for longer than felt comfortable. The property was large. She felt the size of it more than she saw it the way space registers as a change in air pressure when you've spent your whole life in apartments where the walls were close. Inside the house was quiet in the specific way of places where silence is maintained rather than arrived at naturally. Staff moved through hallways with practiced invisibility, and Claire felt a strange, dislocated recognition she knew how to do that. She had done it for years. From the other side, it felt different. Marco showed her to a room on the second floor. Clean, well-lit, a window that looked out over a lawn that had been recently cut. A lock on the inside of the door that she checked immediately, and Marco noticed her checking and said nothing, which she appreciated. "Mr. Moretti will see you at dinner," Marco said. 6 o'clock. You're not obligated." "I know I'm not obligated," she said. "Some people need to be told." "I'm not some people." He studied her for a moment. Then he said, "No, I'm beginning to understand that." He moved toward the door. "Sasha will be back at 3 to check your dressing. There's a phone on the nightstand direct line to the security desk if you need anything. The grounds are accessible, but stay within the east fence. We'll be reconfiguring the west perimeter today." "Reconfiguring," she said. "Is that a technical term?" "It's a polite term," he said. He left. She sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at her hands. They were steady, which surprised her. Everything else felt like it was moving very fast, like the world had shifted to a different frame rate overnight, and she was still adjusting. But her hands were steady. She took that as information. At 3 o'clock, Sasha changed her dressing. The wound looked worse in daylight than it had felt in the dark, an angry red line along her shoulder that would scar Sasha, told her, matter-of-factly, but would heal cleanly if she kept it dry and didn't strain the left arm. Claire said she understood. She didn't ask the questions she actually wanted to ask, which were questions about Victor Moretti, what Sasha knew about him, how long she'd worked here, whether she thought this place was safe. She didn't ask because she knew the answers would be shaped by employment, and she needed information that wasn't shaped by anything. At 5:45, she went downstairs. Victor was already in the dining room, standing at the window with his back to her jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a glass of water in one hand. He was looking at something outside, not the lawn, she thought. Something past it. Something the lawn was just in front of. He heard her come in. He turned. "You came," he said. "You said 6 o'clock, she said. "It's 5:55. "I know." Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. The geological event that happens before the smile, the slight warming of the earth. I've been standing here since 5:30. She didn't know what to do with that. She sat down. He sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and the silence had a different quality from the controlled silence of the house. It was the silence of two people who have been through something together and are working out in real time what that thing was and what it means now. "How's your shoulder?" he said. "Sasha says it'll scar." "I'll cover the medical costs, all of them, ongoing." It's not negotiable," he said. "Not hard, just final, the way he said most things. You were injured in a situation that was mine. The responsibility is mine." She looked at him. "You didn't shoot me." "No," he said. "Someone shot you because of me. That's not a distinction I recognize." She sat with that. There was something in the way he said it, not guilty, not self-flagellating, just precise. He had assessed the causality and assigned the liability and was dealing with it. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her since this started. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once. Food appeared brought in by staff who moved with the same practiced invisibility she'd spent years practicing herself, and she noticed now how strange it felt to be on the receiving end of it, to be the person being taken care of rather than the person doing the taking care. They ate for a few minutes in silence. Then she said, "Detective Hale told me about your business." Victor set down his fork. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a door to open and was now deciding how far to let it. "What did he tell you?" he said. "Enough," she said. "Organized crime, Eastern Seaboard, the legitimate businesses as surface." She met his eyes. He was fairly thorough. "Hale usually is," Victor said. "Is it true?" A pause. Not evasive, she could tell the difference between a pause that was buying time and a pause that was choosing honesty. This was the second kind. "The legitimate businesses are real," he said. "They generate real revenue. They employ real people." He picked up his glass. "The other part is also true." She had known it was. Hearing him confirm it still landed differently than she expected. Not shock, she was past shock. Something more complicated. The feeling of standing in a place you can see clearly and still not being sure whether to move forward or back. "Does that change your assessment of last night?" he said. "My assessment of last night," she said slowly, "is that I heard a sound and I moved. I didn't know who you were when I moved. I didn't know any of this." A pause. "So no, it doesn't change that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why did you come here? You could have said no to Marco." "Hale told me someone looked up my home address 4 hours after the shooting." "Yes. He also told me your security resources are more robust than what the NYPD can currently provide." She looked at him directly. "That's a very specific thing for a detective to say." "Hale and I have an understanding," Victor said. "It's complicated. Most things in your world seem to be complicated. Most things in any world are complicated," he said. "People just prefer not to see it." She thought about that. She thought about her mother's apartment in Woodside and the cost of the medication and the 12-hour shifts and all the ways she'd made things look simpler than they were by absorbing the complexity herself quietly without telling anyone. She understood what he meant. She understood it in a way that surprised her. "My mother's alone," she said, "in Queens. There are 2 of my people outside her building," he said. "Have been since this morning." She stopped. "Without asking me." "Without asking you," he confirmed. "I'm sorry for that. I should have called. I made a unilateral decision because the timeline felt urgent." He held her gaze. "If you want them pulled, I'll make the call right now." She thought about her mother sitting in the apartment with the phone in her hand. She thought about someone looking up addresses at 3 in the morning. "Leave them," she said. He nodded. They finished dinner. The silence between them had shifted again. It was more settled now, less like 2 people figuring out a language, and more like 2 people who had found unexpectedly that they already shared one. At the end of the meal, as the staff cleared the table, Victor said, "I owe you something. I don't know how to give you." She looked up. "My life," he said, simply, without drama. "You gave it back to me. I've been thinking about what that means since 4 in the morning, and I don't have a satisfactory answer." "You don't need to have an answer," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not comfortable with that." She almost smiled. "I noticed." A silence. Then he said, "Stay, for as long as you need, until this is resolved. After that," he stopped. "After that, whatever you need, a job, a different apartment, your mother's medical costs in full, whatever." "I'm not for sale," she said immediately. "I know that," he said, and the way he said it, flat, certain, not defensive, told her he actually did know it. "I'm not buying anything. I'm trying to discharge a debt in a world where I don't have many legitimate means of doing that." She looked at him for a long moment, at the gray-brown eyes and the jaw and the stillness. And underneath the stillness, the things she'd sensed in the restaurant, and sensed again, now the exhaustion of someone who had been holding everything together for a very long time and was starting to feel the weight of it. "We'll figure it out," she said. He nodded, and for the first time, he looked just slightly less like a man managing everything. She went upstairs at 9 o'clock. She called her mother. Her mother was fine. She'd met one of Victor's men, briefly hadn't known who he was, thought he was a new neighbor, had offered him cookies, which he had apparently accepted. Claire said, "Of course he did." Her mother said, "He was very polite." Claire said, "I'm glad." They talked for 30 minutes about nothing important. It was the best 30 minutes of the last 2 days. She fell asleep before 10 and slept without dreaming, which was its own kind of mercy. Day 2 at the estate was quieter. She moved through it carefully, learning the rhythms of the place. The shift changes of the security staff, the hours when the house was most and least active, the specific geography of where she was allowed to move and where she wasn't. She was not a prisoner. She knew the difference. But she was also not free in the way she was used to, and the gap between those two things was where most of the discomfort lived. She found a small library on the ground floor, sat in it for 2 hours, read the same page 4 times, gave up and sat looking at the ceiling instead. At 2 in the afternoon, Marco found her there. He came in without knocking, which she'd already identified as a habit rather than rudeness. Marco Romano was a man who knocked when he expected a closed conversation and walked in when he expected information to be exchanged. This was information. "We have a situation," he said. She sat up. "What kind?" He sat down across from her. He was carrying a tablet which he set on the table between them without showing her the screen yet. "Last night, between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., we identified 3 separate surveillance attempts on this property. 2 vehicles, 1 drone. All have been dealt with." He paused. "What concerns us is not the attempts themselves. What concerns us is that the vectors they used suggest knowledge of our external perimeter configuration that should not be available to anyone outside this organization." She heard what he wasn't saying. "There's a leak." "We believe so," he said. "Yes. Someone inside told them where you were." A beat. "And now that I'm here, someone inside knows I'm here." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "How many people know I'm at this property?" "As of yesterday, 14. "And you trust all 14? Marco's jaw tightened fractionally. "As of yesterday, yes. As of this morning, we are reassessing." "Who's doing the reassessing?" "Mr. Moretti." "Personally?" "Personally." She thought about what that meant. Victor going through a list of 14 people who worked for him, who had built their livelihoods around him, who he had trusted with the information of where he was, and now where she was, and running each of them through a filter that could only have one of 2 outcomes. "That's not a good day to be having," she said. "No," Marco said. "It is not. Does he know who it is yet?" "He has a working theory." Marco paused again. "Ms. Morgan, I'm telling you this because you have a right to understand your situation. But I'm also telling you because Mr. Moretti asked me to tell you. He didn't want you hearing activity in the house today and filling in the blanks yourself." She looked at him. "He thought I'd figure it out." He said, and I'm quoting directly, "She'll know something's wrong within the first hour. Tell her the truth before she starts working with incomplete information." She sat with that for a moment. The particular feeling of being accurately predicted by someone you'd known for less than 72 hours. It wasn't comfortable. It was also she couldn't quite help it something close to flattering. "Tell him I appreciate the honesty," she said. "He'll be glad to hear it," Marco said. Then, "Stay in the East Wing today. There will be movement in other parts of the house that I'd prefer you not to be adjacent to." Movement, she said. Conversations, Marco said. Some of which may become elevated. She understood. Okay. He stood. He picked up the tablet. He was at the door when she said Marco. He stopped. If it comes down to it, she said, and someone has to make a hard choice about the person who leaked, I want you to know I'm not going to be in this building pretending I don't know what that choice looks like. Marco looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression was unreadable, but it was a different kind of unreadable from his usual not controlled but considering. Mr. Moretti said you'd say something like that too, he said. What did he say to it? He said, tell her I know. Marco left. She stayed in the East Wing. She heard the elevated conversations Marco had referenced. Not the words the house was well built enough to swallow specifics, but the tonal shape of them. The particular register of male voices under pressure. The kind of thing that didn't need language to communicate its content. She sat in the small library and read the same page she'd been failing to read all day and listened to the house move around her like something alive and in pain. At 4:30, it stopped. The silence that followed was different from the controlled silence of the house's normal operation. It was the silence of something having been decided. At 5:15, Victor came to find her. He knocked this time. She said, "Come in." He came in and sat in the chair across from her, and she could see immediately that something had changed in him, not broken, but reconfigured, like a machine that has been running at a particular voltage and has had to shift to a different one and is still adjusting to the output. It was Caruso, he said. She didn't know the name. She waited. He's been with me for 9 years, Victor said. He managed external logistics. He knew my schedule, my locations, the restaurant booking. A pause. He had a daughter who needed a surgery his salary didn't cover. Someone found that and offered to cover it in exchange for information. He took it. She didn't say anything. The weight of that landed in the room, and she let it land. A daughter, she said finally. Yes. And the surgery. Already paid for, Victor said. Whoever hired him paid immediately before he delivered anything so he couldn't back out. His voice was level. But underneath it, she heard it now, the thing that she'd started to hear in the restaurant and had been hearing more clearly ever since the weariness. It's a very efficient leverage point. Someone with a child who needs something. You offer the thing. You pay first. And then the man is trapped because the thing has already been done and he can't undo it. That's a sophisticated operation, she said. The Castellano network, Victor said. They've been building towards something for 2 years. This is the opening move. She absorbed that. Castellano, a name she would come to know very well. What happens to Caruso? Victor looked at her, really looked at her. The question had landed somewhere specific in him, she could tell. I haven't decided, he said. What are your options? In my world, he said, the traditional options are limited. In my world, she said carefully, when someone does something wrong because they were backed into a corner by circumstances they didn't create and then exploited by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, we call that a complicated situation. And what do you do with complicated situations in your world? We try to distinguish between the person who created the problem and the person who got caught in it, she said. They're not the same person. Victor was quiet for a long time. The afternoon light was changing. Outside somewhere she heard a car door, then another. The shift change. The estate continuing to function, absorbing what had happened today moving forward, because stopping was not an option. The man who created this problem, Victor said slowly, is the man who found Caruso's daughter and wrote the check. That man works for Castellano, and Castellano is going to keep sending people at me at Caruso at... He stopped. At me, she said. He met her eyes. Yes. The word sat between them. Not a threat. A fact. The most honest and most frightening kind of thing. Then we need to make him run out of people to send, she said. Victor looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, You are not what I expected. You said something like that in the restaurant, she said, before the shot. Did I? You said most people don't hear it. She tilted her head. That was what you meant, wasn't it? You weren't just talking about the sound. He didn't answer, which was she was learning the way he confirmed things he wasn't ready to say aloud. She stood up. Her shoulder ached. It ached in a specific located way that reminded her with each pulse of it exactly how she'd gotten here and why. She thought about Caruso, about a daughter, about the surgery that had already been paid for the trap already closed. She thought about the Castellano network building towards something for 2 years and choosing Victor Moretti as the opening move. She thought about the click, the half second before everything changed, the moment between the world being one thing and the world being another. "What are you going to do with Caruso?" she said again. Victor stood. He was very close now, not close in the way of intention, but close in the way of a room that had gotten smaller during a conversation. He looked at her with the expression she was starting to learn, the one that wasn't quite anything. She had a name for the one that was too precise to be called gentleness and too warm to be called calculation. "I'm going to send him somewhere," he said, "with enough money to cover the rest of whatever his daughter needs, and I'm going to tell him that the next conversation we have will be the last one." She breathed. "That's more mercy than most people in your world would offer." "You think it's mercy," he said. "The people in my world will think it's weakness." "Is it?" He looked at her for a long, still moment, and in that moment she thought she saw beneath the suit, beneath the stillness, beneath the 30 years of building something that looked like power from the outside, and felt she was beginning to understand. Like a very sophisticated cage from the inside, she saw a man who was genuinely asking himself the same question. "I don't know," he said. And that answer, more than anything else he'd said, was the most honest thing she'd heard from him. "Neither do I," she said. "But I think it matters that you're asking." He looked away. He looked back. Then he said, 6 o'clock, dinner, if you're not tired of eating across from me." She said, "I'll be there at 5:55. He almost smiled. Not almost. He smiled. A real one, brief, unguarded, like something that had escaped before he could contain it. It changed his face entirely and was gone again in under a second. He left. She stood in the small library with her aching shoulder and the sound of the house settling around her, and she thought, I don't know how to measure this. Any of it. The safety that is also confinement. The man who is also a danger. The kindness that coexists without apparent contradiction with the thing he has built his entire life on top of. She thought, I've been invisible my whole life. Taking care of things, moving in the background. And now I'm here fully visible, fully seen in the most complicated place I've ever stood, and I don't know whether to be afraid or something else entirely. She thought. One breath at a time. She picked up her book. She read the same page again. This time, finally, the words made sense. Outside the window, the second shift of security personnel were moving into position. 2 of them passed close to the house, talking in low voices that she couldn't hear clearly. One of them laughed at something. The other one shushed him. And then they were past, and the grounds were quiet, and the day moved toward 6 o'clock with the steady indifference of all days everywhere moving forward, because that was the only direction available. Somewhere in the city, in an office that Hale was already building a file on a man named Castellano, looked at a report that told him the first attempt had failed, that Caruso had been neutralized without the intended result, that Claire Morgan was now inside Victor Moretti's protection, rather than exposed in a Queen's apartment where a second approach would have been straightforward. He read the report twice. He set it down. He looked at the man across from him. "How attached?" he said slowly. "Do you think Moretti is to the waitress?" The man across from him said, "It's been 3 days." "That's not what I asked," Castellano said. A silence. "Attached enough," the man said, "to have people outside her mother's building." Castellano nodded. He picked up a pen. He set it down. He looked at the window. "Then we have a new leverage point," he said. Claire heard it through the wall. Not the words, just the tone. Victor's voice, which she had come to read the way you read, weather had a particular quality at 2:17 a.m. that she had never heard from it before. Not loud. The opposite of loud. The kind of quiet that is actually a very controlled form of violent. She was awake before the call ended. She didn't know why. Her body had developed over the past 6 days at the estate a sensitivity to the house's rhythms that she hadn't consciously cultivated, the way people who live near the ocean stop hearing the waves and start hearing when the waves change. She heard the quality of the silence after Victor stopped talking. She heard footsteps in the hall. Marco's, she could identify them now, the specific weight and pace of them. She heard a door, then another. She got up. She was in the hallway before she'd made a conscious decision to be there, and Marco nearly walked into her. He stopped. He looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise with something that was almost resignation, like a man who has been told something would happen and has just watched it happen. "Ms. Morgan." "What happened?" she said. He looked at her for 1 second, then, "Get dressed. Come downstairs." She was dressed in 4 minutes. Downstairs in 5. Victor was in the study, a room she'd been in twice before, once when he'd shown it to her deliberately, and once when she'd found it by accident, and he hadn't asked her to leave. He was standing with his back to the door phone in his hand, the kind of stillness that meant the stillness was doing a lot of work. "Victor." She used his name. It came out naturally, without the hesitation she expected. They'd been past first names for 4 days, though she couldn't identify the exact moment it had shifted. He turned. His face told her before his words did. Not fear, she had already come to understand that fear was not a category he accessed easily, but something adjacent to it, something that lived in the same neighborhood as fear, and was in many ways worse because it was specific. "They went to your mother's building," he said. The floor did something, not literally, but her body registered the words as physical impact, and she felt herself go very still in the way that is the opposite of calm, the stillness of a system under sudden and massive load. "Is she?" "She's fine," he said immediately. The 2 words hit her like a hand on a shoulder. "She's fine. My men intercepted the approach before it reached the building. Your mother was never in direct danger." He paused. "But it was close. Close enough that I've had her moved." "Moved where?" "Somewhere safer. She was told there was a gas leak in her building. She's in a hotel. She thinks it's temporary. She's comfortable." His voice was completely controlled. "I'm sorry for not consulting you. The timeline—" "Stop apologizing for the timeline," Claire said. Her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "Is she actually okay? She has a cardiac history. If someone scared her—" "My people are with her. They have her medical file. I had it pulled yesterday as a precaution. She is medically stable and annoyed about the gas leak." Despite everything, despite the 2:17 a.m. call and the floor doing its thing and the specific terror that had moved through her body like cold water, she felt something release slightly at that. Her mother being annoyed was her mother being fine. Her mother being afraid was the thing she couldn't have managed. "A gas leak," she said. It seemed like the most plausible explanation for being asked to leave an apartment at midnight without causing panic. "She's going to figure it out," Claire said. She's not a woman who stays fooled for long." "I know," Victor said, and then quietly, "She sounds like someone else I've recently met." She looked at him. He held her gaze. Between them, the thing that had been building since day 1 of the estate, since dinner at 5:55, since the library, and the conversation about Caruso, and the smile that had escaped before he could contain it, that thing was very present right now, and neither of them addressed it directly because they were both people who understood that some things get damaged by being named too soon. "Tell me about the approach," she said. "Who did they send?" Marco from the doorway said, "2 men. Armed. They watched the building from a car for approximately 40 minutes before moving. Our team moved first." "How did Castellano know about my mother?" Marco and Victor exchanged a look. The half-second of it told her the answer before either of them spoke. "The news coverage," Victor said. "The initial stories, the hero-waitress narrative. Several of them mentioned your background. Queens, your family." She thought about this. She thought about the news alerts on her phone. She thought about the way information, once it enters the public stream, becomes infrastructure that anyone can use. She thought about the reporter who had described her as a single daughter caring for an ailing mother in Queens, and had probably thought it was a sympathetic detail, and had not thought about what else it was. "Castellano read the papers," she said flatly. "Castellano reads everything," Victor said. "That's how he operates. He identifies pressure points through publicly available information. He's been doing it for 15 years, and he's very good at it. And my mother, Claire said, is a pressure point. Yes. She sat down. She hadn't planned to sit down, but her legs made the decision, and she was in the chair before her pride could object. Her shoulder was throbbing. It did that when she was under stress, a physical reminder that would probably outlast the stitches by years. She pressed her palm against it. She breathed. "Okay," she said. Both men looked at her. "Okay," she said again. "What do we do?" Victor said. "We need to talk about Castellano." "Then talk," she said. "All of it. Not the managed version. The real version." Another look between Victor and Marco, shorter this time. Victor nodded. Marco came fully into the room. He closed the door. He sat. And then for the next hour, in the 2 a.m. quiet of the estate study, Victor Moretti told Claire Morgan the real version. Castellano, full name Enzo. Castellano had built his operation over 23 years from a Brooklyn base that had expanded steadily through legitimate and illegitimate means in parallel, a strategy that Victor himself recognized because it was a version of his own. The difference was methodology. Victor's approach, however violent at its origins, had trended over the past decade toward consolidation, toward stability, toward the kind of operation that sustained itself through systems rather than constant force. Castellano's approach trended the other way, expansion through disruption, breaking what existed and rebuilding it under his architecture. Victor was the largest structural obstacle to that expansion on the eastern seaboard. He had been for several years the line that Castellano couldn't cross. The restaurant attack was not the first attempt. It was the first that had come that close. "And why now?" Claire said. "You said he's been building toward this for 2 years. Why did he move now?" Victor looked at his hands, then at her. "There's a federal investigation. It's been ongoing for 18 months. The pressure it creates on networks, on relationships, on the informal agreements that keep organizations stable, that pressure is increasing. Castellano calculates that there's a window, that if he can restructure the Eastern Seaboard's power distribution before the investigation reaches critical mass, he can position himself as the dominant architecture in a way that's very difficult to dismantle afterward. "And you're in the window," she said. "I'm the window," he said. She sat with that, the scope of it, the way it made the restaurant attack feel not like a crime, but like a chess move, which it was, and which made it somehow more frightening rather than less. "Hale knows about the investigation," she said. "Hale is part of the investigation," Victor said. "That's the complicated understanding I mentioned." She remembered. Complicated, he'd said. She was beginning to appreciate the full meaning of that word in his vocabulary. "What does Hale want from you?" "Testimony, documentation, names that complete the picture of what Castellano is building. In exchange for—" He stopped. "In exchange for what?" "A structured exit," Marco said when Victor didn't. "For this organization, over time, with legal protections for certain individuals." He paused. "It's been under negotiation for 14 months. She looked at Victor. "You've been negotiating a way out." He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the desk. He looked at his hands. He looked at her. "I've been negotiating," he said, "a way through. Out is a large word. There are obligations I can't simply exit. People who depend on the organization's infrastructure, not criminals, employees, families. People who would be harmed by a sudden collapse." He paused. "A structured transition over several years. That's what's on the table." She thought about this very carefully, about what it meant that he was telling her, about why he was telling her. She was not under any illusion that it was purely informational. Victor Moretti did not share information without purpose. But she also did not think he was manipulating her. She had gotten over 6 days a reasonably accurate read on the difference between his purposefulness and manipulation, and this felt like the former. He was telling her because she was in the middle of it, because she had a right to know what she was in the middle of, and because, and this she felt, rather than knew, he had been carrying this particular weight without telling anyone for 14 months, and the weight was significant. "Does Castellano know about the negotiation with Hale?" she said. Victor and Marco exchanged the look again. This time it was longer. "We believe Marco said carefully, that Castellano has a source inside the federal investigation. The room went very quiet. That's why he moved now, Claire said. He found out about the negotiation. He knows you're trying to exit. If you exit successfully, he loses his window. He loses the restructuring opportunity. So he has to move before the exit is complete. Neither man spoke. And the restaurant attack was the opening of a campaign, Victor said. Yes. And my mother. Leverage. To force me to either capitulate or to fight in a way that destroys the negotiation with Hale. His jaw was set. If I respond with force to what happened tonight, I break the terms of the understanding. The federal investigation pivots from cooperative to adversarial. Everything falls apart. And if you don't respond with force, Castellano reads it as weakness and escalates. He looked at her directly. There is no clean path through this, Claire. I want you to understand that clearly. She did understand it. She understood it the way she understood 12-hour shifts and medical bills and the particular mathematics of a situation where every available option cost something significant. You just had to decide which cost you could bear. Then we make a different kind of response, she said. Both men looked at her. What does Castellano want most? She said. Not what he says he wants, what he actually wants. Victor said, control of the territory. No, she said. That's the outcome he wants. What does he want in the actual moment? What's the operative desire? A silence. Then Victor said slowly, to be the most powerful person in the room. Right, she said. He wants to win. And right now the way winning is defined by him, by the people watching, by whoever his source inside the federal investigation is reporting back to winning means you either break or you fight. Those are the only two options he's given you. She leaned forward. So you give him a third option he didn't anticipate. You make a move that isn't retreat and isn't escalation, something he hasn't modeled. Victor was very still. What move? You meet with him, she said. The silence that followed was the loudest silence she had heard in the estate, which was a house full of calculated silences. Marco said, That's Ms. Morgan, a direct meeting with Castellano under current circumstances. Not a confrontation, she said, a negotiation, but not the one he expects. He expects you to either come begging or come armed. You come with something he doesn't have and can't get anywhere else. She looked at Victor. The federal investigation, the structured exit. You offer him a version of what you've been negotiating, but shaped so that his cooperation is built into it. He gets his expansion. You get your exit. The investigation gets what it needs from both of you instead of one. The room was extremely quiet for a long time. Victor said, You're describing a scenario in which I convince a man who just sent people to threaten my... He stopped. He started again. A man who just sent people to a building where your mother lives to sit across from me and negotiate in good faith. I'm describing a scenario, she said, in which you give a man who is currently holding all the aggressive momentum a reason to stop. People don't stop when they're winning because you ask them to. They stop when continuing becomes more expensive than stopping. She met his eyes. Right now, continuing costs him very little. You need to change the math. Victor looked at her for a very long time. The gray-brown eyes she still couldn't fully classify in any lighting. The stillness that was doing enormous work. Then he said, Hale would never agree to include Castellano in the negotiation. What did Hale want, she said. Testimony, documentation, names. He wants the picture complete. You give him more of the picture, more names, more documentation, and you give him a second cooperating party instead of just one. A beat. Hale is a pragmatist. You told me that. Give him something more pragmatic than what he already has. Marco said, This is... He stopped. He started again. This is either the most intelligent thing I've heard in this room, or it's the most dangerous. In my experience, Claire said, those are usually the same thing. Victor almost smiled. He turned away. He walked to the window, not to look at anything outside, she understood now, but because he thought better when he was moving, when there was a direction to face, even if the direction was arbitrary. She'd learned that about him. There was a list of things she'd learned about him, and it was longer than she'd expected, and more specific than she was entirely comfortable with. She waited. At 3:45 a.m., an hour and 28 minutes after the call that had pulled her out of bed, Victor turned back from the window. "I'll call Hale at 6, he said. "Before I say anything to Castellano, I need to know whether there's space in the current framework for an expansion of the cooperative agreement. And if Hale says no, then we find a different angle." He looked at her with an expression that was direct and unguarded in a way that his face wasn't always. "You should know what you just described, the structure of it, the logic that's not a civilian way of thinking about this. I grew up working," she said. "Working-class people think about leverage and math and the cost of every option every day. We just don't usually do it in rooms this nice." Something moved across his face. Not the almost smile. Something fuller. Something that belonged to a person who had just heard something true. "No," he said. "I suppose you don't." The call to Hale happened at 6:12 a.m. Claire was not in the room for it. Victor made that call alone, which she understood and didn't challenge. She was in the kitchen with a real cup of coffee made by a man named Ernesto, who worked the early kitchen shift and who had on day 3 of her stay started making her coffee without being asked because he had noticed she came down early and looked like she needed it. She appreciated Ernesto enormously. She was on her second cup when Marco came in. "Hale said yes," Marco said. She set down the cup. "To which part?" "To exploring whether the framework can be expanded." Marco pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, which was unusual. Marco rarely sat when he could stand. It meant the information was significant enough that he wanted to be level with her when he delivered it. He also said, and I'm quoting directly, because Mr. Moretti said you'd want the exact words. He also said, "Tell Moretti the woman in that house is either the best thing that's happened to this negotiation or I'm in the wrong business." She looked at her coffee, then at Marco. "What did Victor say to that?" Marco almost smiled. He said, "Both." Ernesto refilled her cup without being asked. At 10:30 a.m. Hale arrived at the estate in person. She knew this because she heard the gate and then heard voices in the entry hall and then heard the particular quality of Victor's voice when he was managing a conversation with someone he respected but did not fully trust a careful register she'd identified around day 4. She stayed out of it. She went back to the library. She sat with a book she was actually reading now, and she thought about her mother in a hotel room being annoyed about a gas leak. And she thought about Caruso somewhere with his daughter's medical bills paid and a second chance he probably didn't expect. And she thought about the click. Always the click. The sound before everything. She thought about how you could spend your whole life invisible and useful and careful, absorbing the complexity so that others didn't have to. And then one moment, 1/2 second of not thinking of pure reflex could drag you into a situation so complicated that you couldn't see the edges of it. She thought about whether she would do it again. She thought yes, without hesitation. Not because of anything she'd learned about Victor in 6 days, but because of what she'd known before she knew anything that a person was in danger, and she was the only thing between them and it. That was not a complex calculation. That was the simplest thing she knew. At 1:15 p.m., Victor came to find her in the library. He knocked. She said, "Come in." He came in and sat across from her, and she closed the book and waited. "Hale agrees to the expanded framework in principle," he said. "There are conditions. There are always conditions. But the structure you described last night, a negotiated arrangement that brings Castellano in rather than leaving him as an external threat, Hale believes it's viable. More viable, frankly, than the previous arrangement. Because it resolves more of the problem," she said. "Because it resolves more of the problem," he confirmed. "What are the conditions?" "Timeline. Certain assets that need to be disclosed that I'd have preferred to keep undisclosed. A monitoring arrangement for 3 years post-transition." He paused. "All manageable." "And Castellano, that meeting," Victor said slowly, "is the part that keeps me up at night." "It kept you up last night," she said. "You were up at 2:17. He looked at her. "You heard the call." "I heard the quality of your voice through the wall, not the words." "What did my voice tell you?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "That you were afraid," she said. "Not of Castellano, of something more specific than that." He was quiet. "Of not being able to protect something," she said. "That's what fear sounds like in a person who doesn't usually let themselves feel it. It comes out as a very controlled kind of quiet." He looked at his hands. "You are remarkably difficult to have in one's house," he said, "from an information security standpoint. I told you I spent years being invisible. The skill set transfers." He almost laughed. Almost. "Then, the meeting with Castellano needs to happen within the next 10 days, before he makes another move, before the situation escalates in a way that forecloses the negotiation option." He looked at her directly. "I want you to know that regardless of how the meeting goes, your mother's security, your security, all of it, that's not contingent on the outcome of any of this. I want to be clear about that." "I know," she said. "I need you to actually know it, not just to say it. Victor." She said his name the way she'd said it at 2:17 a.m., directly without hesitation. "I know. I believe you." He held her gaze. And then very quietly he said, "I don't have a great deal of experience with people who take me at my word." "That," she said, "sounds incredibly lonely." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was in the way his face moved around the edges, not breaking, but registering, receiving. The expression of a person who has been offered something true and doesn't quite know where to put it. They sat in the small library in the afternoon light for another few minutes, just sitting, not managing anything, not calculating anything, just two people in a complicated situation, breathing the same air, and in that ordinary act, breathing, being present, not being alone, something that had been wire-tight between them, released just slightly, just enough to matter. At 2 p.m., Marco knocked on the library door. "Mr. Moretti," he said. "Castellano's people reached out." Both of them looked up. "He's requesting a meeting," Marco said. "His timeline." Victor looked at Marco, then at Claire. Something passed between all three of them, the recognition of a moment arriving before it was expected, which was the way moments like this always arrived. "Tell them," Victor said, "that we'll be in touch with our terms." Marco nodded. He started to leave. Then he stopped. He turned back. His expression was unusual, not controlled in its normal way, but carrying something he appeared to be deciding whether to say. He said it, his message also said, and this came directly not through intermediaries, that he'd like Ms. Morgan present at the meeting. The air in the room changed. Victor's face did something she had not seen it do before. A full, unmanaged reaction. Not anger, but something that moved through the territory of anger, on its way to becoming something colder and more considered. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then it was gone, replaced by the controlled surface. But she had seen it, and she knew what it meant. Castellano knew about her. Not just from the news coverage, not just from the hero waitress narrative. He knew about the estate, about her role in the negotiation strategy, about what she had become in 6 days inside Victor Moretti's orbit. Someone had told him. "The second leak," she said quietly. Victor's jaw tightened. "Yes." "Someone knew," Marco said. "Someone who knew about the negotiation strategy, which means someone present in this house in the last 14 hours. The number of people who had been present in the last 14 hours was very small. The meeting about Hale, the kitchen conversation about the framework, the people who had moved through those hours with access to that specific information. Victor stood. The controlled stillness was back, but it was a different kind now, the stillness of something that has decided. "Lock down all external communications," he said to Marco. "No one leaves the property until I've spoken to each of them personally." He looked at Claire. "I'm sorry. This is going to be an unpleasant afternoon." "I've had worse," she said. He looked at her for one moment. Then, "Not recently." He was right about that. She sat with the truth of it as he and Marco moved through the door as the house shifted into a different register again, the particular pressurized quiet of a place where trust has just fractured and no one yet knows where the break is. And she thought about Castellano, about a man she hadn't met who had sent people to her mother's building, who was reading her the same way Victor had read her, as a leverage point, as a variable in the calculation, but with entirely different intentions. She thought, he wants me at the table because I'm something Victor cares about. He thinks that makes me a weakness. She thought, he's about to find out it makes me something else. Outside the library, she could hear Victor's voice moving through the house, still controlled, still precise. But underneath it, she could hear it. She could always hear it now. Something that had been pushed past a line. She picked up her book. She didn't read it. She held it and she thought, and she waited for the afternoon to become whatever it was going to become. Her shoulder throbbed. Her coffee had gone cold. Somewhere in a hotel in a borough she loved her mother was annoyed about a gas leak. And in a building in the city, a man named Castellano was waiting for an answer. He was about to get one he didn't expect. The second leak had a name by 6 p.m. His name was Torres. He had worked for Victor for 4 years, managing communications between the estate and the legal team. He was 31 years old. He had a gambling debt that had reached a number that changed a person's decision-making in ways they didn't always see coming. Castellano's people had found the debt the same way they'd found Caruso's daughter, through patient, methodical research into the pressure points of people who surrounded the man they wanted to reach. Victor found out at 5:47. Claire knew because she heard the quality of the silence that came after Marco said the name in the hallway outside the library. That specific silence, the one that wasn't empty, but full-packed with something being processed and contained simultaneously, she could read it now, the way she read everything about this house, the way she'd come to read him. At 6:15, Torres was driven off the property, not harmed, not threatened, simply removed with the weight of Victor's knowledge resting on him like a sentence that had been handed down without requiring words. At 6:30, Victor came back to the library. He sat. He didn't say anything for a full minute. She let him have the minute. Then he said, "I keep surrounding myself with people whose breaking points I don't find until they've already broken." "That's not a failure of your judgment," she said. "That's a failure of the circumstances those people are put in. There's a difference." "Is there?" His voice wasn't self-pitying. It was genuinely asking. "Yes," she said. "The man who finds the debt and pays someone to exploit it, he's responsible for the break. Not you, not Torres." A beat. "Castellano is very good at finding cracks. That's not a reflection of the wall." Victor looked at her. "You defend people who've betrayed me with more conviction than most people defend themselves." "I'm not defending what they did," she said. "I'm locating the actual source of the damage. Those aren't the same thing." He was quiet again. Then, "The meeting with Castellano. I've set terms, neutral location, limited personnel on both sides, 4 days from now." He looked at her directly. He reiterated his request for your presence. "I know," she said. "I'm not going to ask you to do something like that." "I know that too," she said. "I'm going to do it anyway." He went very still. "Claire." "He thinks I'm a pressure point," she said. "He thinks if I'm in the room, he has leverage on you that he can use to control the direction of the negotiation. He's planning to use me against you." She held his gaze. "Let him think that, and then let me be the thing that changes what the room feels like." A long silence. "You understand what kind of man Castellano is," Victor said. It wasn't a question. "I understand he's a man who finds other people's vulnerabilities and turns them into weapons," she said. "I've met that kind of person before. They're less frightening when you've already decided you're not going to break." Victor looked at her for a long moment, the gray-brown eyes that she had stopped trying to categorize, the stillness that was doing its work, and underneath both of those things, the things she'd heard at 2:17 a.m., the things she'd seen when Marco said Torres's name in the hallway. The particular weight of a person who has been alone inside a very complicated architecture for a very long time. "If anything," he started. "Nothing will," she said. "You can't know that." "No," she said, "but I can decide to walk in like I do. That's enough." He looked away. He looked back. Then quietly, with the precision he brought to everything that mattered, "I don't know how you do that." "Do what?" "Walk toward things." She thought about her mother, about 12-hour shifts, about the click, about every moment in her life that had required moving towards something hard because the alternative was standing still, and she had never been able to stand still when someone needed something. "You do it too," she said. "You've been doing it for 30 years. You just don't notice it anymore because it's all you know." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The meeting was set for Thursday. 4 days that moved, the way days move when something is coming unevenly, with the hours stretching in some places and compressing in others, time behaving like a physical thing, being bent by the gravity of the approaching event. Hale called on Tuesday morning. Claire was not in the room, but Marco told her afterward, word for word, because that was the arrangement they had arrived at naturally over the past week. Marco, as the conduit between the two halves of this situation, moving information between them with the reliability and discretion of a man who understood that information managed well, was its own kind of protection. Hale had said the expanded framework was conditionally approved by his supervisors. The conditions were significant but not insurmountable. The key variable was whether Castellano would engage in good faith, which Hale assessed at 40% likelihood, which meant 60% likelihood of the meeting producing nothing except a read on Castellano's current posture. 40%, Claire thought. She had worked tables where 40% of the guests were impossible, and she had still gotten through the shift. On Wednesday evening, Victor knocked on the library door and came in without waiting for an answer, which was new. He had always waited before. The not waiting told her something: either he was past the formality or the situation had pushed him past it. Both were probably true. He sat. He put something on the table between them. A folder, thin. He didn't open it. "I want to tell you something before tomorrow," he said. "Something that isn't about the meeting." She waited. "When I was 23, he said, I made a decision that set the direction of the next 30 years. I made it because of circumstances and because of who I was at 23, and because the alternative at the time felt like nothing, like disappearing." He paused. "I've been trying to work out for a long time whether a different decision was available that I didn't see, or whether I saw it and couldn't take it." She didn't say anything. She understood he wasn't looking for absolution. He was looking for something to do with the truth of it before tomorrow, when the truth would need to be set aside to function. "What would the different decision have looked like?" she said. He thought about it. Actually thought about it. She could see him doing it the real work of the question, rather than a deflection from it. "Smaller," he said finally. "A smaller life. A harder one probably, financially. But one where the weight was mine alone." He looked at the folder without opening it. "I've spent 30 years learning to carry weight that isn't mine because I made myself responsible for too many things. And now I'm trying to put some of it down, and I don't entirely know how to do that without everything collapsing." "The negotiation with Hale," she said. "The structured exit." "Yes, that's the how," she said. "That's you figuring out how to put it down without dropping it." He looked at her. "You make it sound manageable." "It is manageable," she said. "It's not easy. Those aren't the same thing." He opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper. She looked at it. It was a document, legal language dense, but she could read the shape of it. Her name was in it, a financial arrangement, specific, substantial, extending forward in time. She looked up. "Your mother's medical costs," he said. "In full, indefinitely. And a separate arrangement for you for school if you want to go back, for whatever you want to build." He held her gaze. "Before tomorrow. Not contingent on anything. Not contingent on the meeting, not on the outcome, not on—" He stopped. Started again. "I wanted you to have it before, not after, so you know it has nothing to do with anything except what I owe you." She looked at the paper. She thought about the cost of her mother's medication, the number she carried in her head, the way you carry the combination to a lock, automatically, permanently, always accessible. She thought about the degree she'd started and put down when her mother's health declined, the things she'd filed under maybe someday and stopped opening. "Victor, don't tell me you don't need it," he said. "I know you're capable of managing without it. That's not the question. The question is whether you'll let me do the one concrete thing I know how to do." His voice was completely level, but there was something underneath it, the same thing that had been underneath everything since 2:17 a.m. "Please." She looked at the paper. She thought about pride, and she thought about her mother, and she thought about the degree, and she thought about the word please coming from a man who she suspected had used it fewer than 100 times in his adult life and meant it fewer times than that. "Okay," she said. He exhaled, just once, just slightly. The exhale of a person who has been holding something and has just been given permission to set it down. "Thank you," he said. "You keep thanking me," she said. "We're going to run out of things to thank each other for." "I'm not sure we are," he said. Thursday arrived. The neutral location was a building in Midtown, a conference floor managed by a law firm that worked with both sides in the kind of arrangement that existed because New York was a city where every possible combination of people had professional relationships that operated independently of personal ones. Hale would be present off to the side in an observing capacity that was technically unofficial and actually central. The drive-in was quiet. Victor in the back, Marco in front, Claire beside Victor, which was where she had ended up, because the car had 3 seats in the back, and Marco had gotten in front without discussion, and she had gotten in back and the door had closed and they were moving. Victor said nothing for 12 minutes. Then, if you want to change your mind, I don't. The car can turn around. Victor. His name the direct way, the way that meant she was done with the offered exits. I'm here, let's go. He looked at her. Something in his face, the same, something that had been building since the library and the folder and the pleas. Something that was very close to visible now, barely contained by the controlled surface pressing against it from the inside. He said, "Okay." Castellano was already in the room when they arrived. He was smaller than she'd expected. That was always the thing with men who held enormous power, the gap between the size of their influence and the size of their physical presence. He was 60, maybe 62, with silver hair and the compact, deliberate physicality of a man who had spent decades being underestimated and had learned to use it. His eyes moved to her immediately, not to Victor, to her. She looked back at him without flinching. He smiled, the smile of a man who has just received information he was waiting for a read on someone, a confirmation of a theory. He thought her presence here meant what he'd predicted. He thought she was the variable he could use. She let him think it. The table was long. Victor sat on one side, Marco to his left, Claire to his right. Castellano sat across, flanked by 2 men she didn't know. Hale sat at the far end at an angle that was technically outside the main axis of the table, in the observing position that was also the listening position. For the first 10 minutes, it was Victor and Castellano direct measured the language of 2 people who had been circling each other for years and were now finally occupying the same room. The conversation had the density of something that was also a history, every sentence landing against the background of everything that had happened before it. Castellano said, "You've been trying to exit." Victor said, "I've been trying to transition." Transition implies you retain something. Exit implies you give it up. Which is it? Both, Victor said, depending on what you mean by retain. Castellano smiled again. He looked at Claire. And the waitress. What does she retain? The word waitress. The way he used it not as a description, but as a diminishment. A filing of her into a category that made her smaller than she was. She said before Victor could respond, "Mr. Castellano, I understand you requested my presence specifically." He turned to her fully, surprised almost imperceptibly, but she caught it. He hadn't expected her to address him directly. He'd expected her to sit and be the thing she was supposed to be in his model of this meeting. "I did," he said. "Then let's not waste time," she said. "You think I'm here because I'm something he can't afford to lose. You think that gives you a position in this room that changes the negotiation." She held his gaze. "You're right that I matter to him. You're wrong about what that means for you." Silence. Real silence. The kind that means something has entered the room that wasn't expected. Castellano said, "Is that so?" "The leverage you think you have," she said, "requires him to be afraid. And you can't make him afraid because the thing you'd threaten is already protected in ways you can't reach. His response to your approach at my mother's building was to put her somewhere you'll never find. A beat. You burned your leverage the moment you used it. You just don't know it yet." Castellano looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Victor. "You let her talk," he said. "Not a question. Something between observation and respect, and something less comfortable than either." "I listened to her," Victor said. "There's a difference." Castellano leaned back. He was processing. She could see him doing it, the reassessment, the recalibration of what this meeting was and who the people across the table actually were. She said, "What you actually want, Mr. Castellano, is the territory, not the fight. The fight is expensive, and the federal investigation makes it more expensive every month it continues. You know what Hale has. You know what a full prosecution looks like for your organization." She glanced at Hale at the end of the table, who was looking at his notepad with an expression of deliberate neutrality. "What if there was a structure where you got the expansion without the war, without the federal exposure, built into the same framework that Victor's been negotiating?" Castellano was very still. "You're asking me to cooperate with a federal investigation," he said flatly. "I'm asking you to consider whether controlled cooperation on your terms is better than uncontrolled prosecution on theirs," she said. "You're 60 years old. You've built something. A war with Victor destroys it whether you win or lose because Hale closes in during the chaos. A negotiated structure gives you 10 more years of Operation Legitimate Expansion and an exit that doesn't end in a courtroom." The room was extraordinarily quiet. Haley at the end of the table turned a page in his notepad. He didn't look up. Castellano looked at Victor. "Is this your offer delivered through her?" "This is her read of the situation," Victor said, "which matches mine, which Hale's office has conditionally agreed to explore." A pause. "It's not a trick, Enzo. It's a door. You can walk through it, or you can spend the next 18 months watching Hale's team take apart everything you built." A very long silence. Then Castellano said to Claire, "How did a waitress learn to think like this?" "I told you," she said. "I'm not a waitress anymore." Something shifted in Castellano's face. The smile again, but different this time, less calculated, something almost genuine. "No," he said. "I can see that." The meeting lasted 3 more hours. Hale became fully present at the table around the 90-minute mark when it became clear that Castellano was engaging seriously rather than performing engagement. The framework was rough, conditional, full of variables that would take months to work through, but the architecture of it was there. The shape of a solution that 6 days ago had not existed because no one had thought to construct it that way. She didn't say much after the opening. She didn't need to. She had done the thing she came to do, shifted the weight of the room from confrontation to possibility, and the rest was the work of men who had spent decades in this world and knew how to build things inside it. She sat and she listened, and she watched Castellano across the table, and she thought, he came in here thinking I was a weakness. He's leaving understanding I was something else. She didn't know exactly what. She was still working that out herself. The drive back to the estate was different from the drive in. Victor sat beside her, and Marco was in front, and this time, the 12 minutes of silence felt like a different kind. Not the silence of something approaching, but the silence of something having passed. The specific quiet of people who have come through the far side of something and are still taking inventory. Victor said, "Hale's going to call it a breakthrough." "It's a beginning," she said, "not a breakthrough." "He'll still call it a breakthrough. Hale can call it whatever he wants." Victor turned to look at her. The city moved past the windows. "You were extraordinary in there. You keep using that word. Because it keeps being accurate." She looked at him, and she thought about the word extraordinary, and she thought about Marco saying it in the hospital, and Victor saying it now, and the gap between the two moments, everything that had happened in that gap, the stitches and the estate and the library and the folder and the pleas, and she thought, I started this as someone who heard a sound and moved. I don't entirely know what I am now, but it's not what I was before. She thought that was probably the right direction. 6 months passed. They pass the way months pass when they contain real work unevenly, with some weeks feeling like days and some days feeling like weeks with progress that was measurable only in retrospect because it was too incremental to see clearly from inside it. The negotiated framework between Victor's organization, Castellano's network, and Hale's federal investigation took 11 weeks to reach a formal agreement. It was not a clean agreement. Nothing with that many moving parts and that much history was ever clean. But it was a real one. Hale's office called it in the official documentation a structured cooperative transition. Hale called it privately to the two people who had made it possible the most complicated thing he'd ever seen work. Castellano held to the agreement. Not perfectly, there were incidents, adjustments, moments when the structure strained. But he held, because the math held, because Claire had been right about the math. Victor's organization began its transition, slowly, expensively, with the particular pain of any large thing changing direction. Marco managed most of the daily operations of it with the competence and discretion he brought to everything. Victor managed the architecture of it. And somewhere in the process of managing the architecture of one thing's ending, he began to see the shape of what might come after it. Claire went back to school. It was not dramatic. It was paperwork and an orientation session and a Tuesday morning when she sat in a classroom for the first time in 4 years and felt like herself in a way she hadn't expected. Not the woman from before, not the person who had stood in the conference room in Midtown and changed the shape of a negotiation, but something that contained all of those and was still becoming something it hadn't finished becoming yet. She called her mother from the parking lot after orientation. Her mother cried. The good kind of crying, the kind that is really relief, wearing the costume of tears. "I'm proud of you," her mother said. "You're always proud of me," Claire said. "That doesn't make it less true," her mother said. "It makes it more." She thought about that for a long time. She and Victor did not see each other every day. The estate receded into something she had been through rather than somewhere she lived, and the distance between them in the ordinary weeks was real and functional and appropriate. They were not the same kind of people in the same kind of world, and pretending otherwise would have been a dishonesty that neither of them would have tolerated from themselves. But they talked. On the phone at first carefully practically about the ongoing logistics of the transition and the protection arrangements that remained in place and the updates from Hale. Then less practically. Then in the way that people talk when the practical things are the excuse and the actual thing is the conversation itself. She told him about school. He told her about the transition. She told him about her mother's latest appointment. The numbers were better. The medication was working. The doctor had used the word stable with a warmth that meant something more than the clinical definition. He said, "I'm glad." She said, "Me too." He said once, late on a Thursday night, "Do you regret it, any of it?" She thought about the click, the half-second, the floor of a ruined dining room, and a hand on her back that was certain in the middle of everything that wasn't. "No," she said, "not a single second of it." He was quiet. Then, "I do. Some of it." "Which part?" "The part where you got hurt," he said. "The part where your mother spent a night in a hotel being lied to about a gas leak. The part where you had to walk into a room with Castellano and use yourself as a variable." His voice was low and precise and very honest. "I regret all of the parts where the cost landed on you." She thought about what to say to that. She said, "The cost was mine to carry. I picked it up. That matters." "Does it change the weight?" "No," she said, "but it changes what the weight means." A silence. Then he said, "You're going to be something formidable, Claire Morgan." "I'm already something formidable," she said. He laughed. A real laugh, full unguarded, nothing held back. She had heard it twice before, and she thought she could probably count on one hand the number of people who had heard it more than a few times in 30 years. She filed it carefully, the way she filed everything that mattered. The graduation was in May. It was not a large ceremony. The college was not a famous one. The day was ordinary in all the ways. Days are ordinary when they are also the most important days you've had in a long time. The sun doing its uncomplicated work, the chairs set up on a lawn, the names being called one by one in the flat, administrative voice of someone who does not know that any of these names belong to people who have crossed specific distances to reach this moment. Her mother was in the front row. She had dressed for it the blue dress she saved for occasions that required acknowledging their own importance. She was holding a program with both hands, and she had been crying since before it started, which she denied whenever Claire looked at her directly. Claire Morgan's name was called. She walked across this platform. She received the piece of paper that represented 4 years of interrupted work and 6 months of resumed work and 15 years of believing she would get here eventually. She shook the hand of someone whose name she immediately forgot. She smiled for the photographer. She walked back to her seat. And as she settled into the row before she looked for her mother's face, before she did anything else, she looked at the crowd, not searching, just looking. The ordinary scan of a person taking in a room the reflex she'd had her whole working life. He was standing at the edge of the gathering, not seated. He had not presumed a seat, had not announced he would come, had not asked if she wanted him there. He had simply come and he was standing where the crowd thinned, wearing something that was slightly less formal than his usual, which for Victor Moretti meant a jacket without a tie, and he was not looking at his phone or managing anything, or running any calculation that she could see. He was watching her walk back to her seat. Just watching, not controlling, not protecting, not positioning, simply present in the uncomplicated, unpowerful, entirely human way of someone who wanted to witness a moment because the moment mattered and he wanted to be there for it. Their eyes met. She didn't wave. He didn't move. They just held the look for a moment, the length of a breath, the length of the space between a click and a decision. And in that look was everything that had passed between them, the restaurant floor and the estate, and the library, and the meeting in Midtown, and the Thursday phone calls, and the laugh she had filed carefully. All of it present in one exchange between two people standing on opposite sides of a lawn on an ordinary May afternoon. Her mother leaned over and said, "Who is that man?" Claire said. "Someone who taught me something." Her mother looked. Then, with the precision of a woman who had raised her daughter alone and knew her better than any intelligence apparatus on the eastern seaboard, "What did he teach you?" Claire thought about it. She thought about the click and the hand on her back and the please and the laugh and the look across a lawn that was also a conversation that needed no words. "That moving towards something hard," she said, "doesn't have to mean moving alone." Her mother said nothing. She reached over and took Claire's hand and held it the way she'd held it when Claire was 14, and the world had first started being heavy, and they sat together in the May sun, while the rest of the names were called one by one, each one belonging to someone who had crossed a distance to be here. Claire Morgan had crossed the furthest, and she had not crossed it alone. That was the whole story, every piece of it, from a click in a crowded restaurant to a look across a graduation lawn, and it had begun as all the things that matter most begin not with a plan or a decision or a calculation, but with a single reflex in a half-second that no one could have predicted and no one could have stopped. A woman heard a sound that no one else heard. She moved toward it, and that was enough to change everything.